folks, and welcome back to Dapper History, Wild West Edition. Let me guess, y'all city slickers came around these parts because you want to hear a story. Well, gather around the campfire, because I've got a tale for you. Brace yourselves, because this is the true story of George Parrott, the worst outlaw in the wide, wild west. I promise I'm not going to do that voice for the whole video, but I also promise that that voice will be returning several times throughout the video. Now, before we get into George Parrott, I want to take a minute to set the scene. The wide, wild west. The year? The mid-1800s. Now, I hate to be a bummer. Just kidding, I love to be a bummer. But life back in these days was not as fun and rootin' tootin' as the movies would have you believe. More than anything, the Wild West was just dangerous in all aspects. The biggest thing about the Wild West that I learned is that every single day was a fight for survival. Food, water, and medicine were scarce, the sun was hot, the snakes were in your boots. Trade was difficult because the towns were small and isolated, separated by miles and miles of scorching, godless desert. So like if you were in one town and your mom was sick and you called someone in the other town and said, have someone bring medicine over here, there was a very high likelihood that the person bringing the medicine would die along the way, probably from dehydration or boot snakes. Your options back then were either to try to make an honest living as a farmer or a cattle rancher, which was difficult because of the environment, and also outlaws could just show up and wreck your shit for funsies. Or you could try to play it safe and build a life in one of those towns, and again, just hope that the aforementioned outlaws didn't pick you to rob and kill. Or you could be the outlaw. Take what you want, answer to no one, join a gang. Joining a gang pretty much entailed becoming a serial killer and having a bunch of fake friends, which is also the average sorority experience. Now, it might sound like being an outlaw was your best option. And it kind of was. Pretty much unless there was an armed sheriff present while you were committing a crime, you could just leave. You could just leave and no one could stop you unless some dumbass wanted to be a hero. Outlaws also used the barren environment to their advantage. Because each town was so isolated, it would take a while for word to spread of your shenanigans. Meaning that you had like a good chunk of time to do more shenanigans. So yeah, being an outlaw was a pretty sweet deal. Unless you wanted to like go to heaven or something. Life outside the law wasn't all peaches and cream. They had to deal with the same problems as everyone else, like dehydration, lack of resources, snakes in boots, and worst of all, the nicknames. Now I can already hear someone getting ready to say, what do you mean? Cowboy nicknames are cool. Some cowboy nicknames are cool. Some of them. You have been lied to by the liberal media into thinking that all outlaws had some cool name like Billy the Kid or Calamity Jane or something. This was not the reality of the situation. See, the problem is that there were just so many outlaws and a limited amount of actually cool nicknames to go around, meaning that most of them got fucking terrible nicknames. Like, you didn't get to choose your own nickname, you know? Like, usually the public would just start calling you something. And so if you got a lame nickname, like, there was nothing you could do to change it. You're just stuck. Speaking of lame nicknames, I reckon it's about time we met the man of the hour.
They walk, they talk, they shimmy to the music.
Meet George Parrott. I was able to find out very little about his early life in my research. In fact, his Wikipedia literally doesn't have an early life section. But we know enough. We know he wasn't always an outlaw. Originally, he was a humble cattle rancher, until I assume one day he looked around and said, you know, this sucks. I want bitches and money. And so George joined a gang of stagecoach riders, led by a man named Sim Jan. See, I told you not all the nicknames are good. Speaking of terrible nicknames, once he became an outlaw, George earned a cowboy nickname of his own. Want to know what it was? Big Nose.
Bruh.
He was called Big Nose the Outlaw. I would be pissed. Also, like, was his nose really that big? Like, really? Like, so big that people used that characteristic to identify him? There wasn't a single other outlaw with a big nose? I'm just imagining the sheriffs trying to interview a victim of the gang's crimes, and they're like, this group of men came up and they robbed my stagecoach. They took everything I had. It happened so fast, I can't remember anything. Except one of them had this just fucking massive beak. Seriously, like, I don't get it. I'm getting carried away. Big Nose... Big Nose and the rest of Sim Jan's gang spent their days doing typical outlaw stuff. Robbing stagecoaches, robbing travelers, robbing horses. But then, I guess they got a little cocky and decided they wanted to rob a train. Not to like spoil the story or anything, but there is a difference between robbing some guy on a horse and robbing 6,000 pounds of speeding iron. Okay, I'm sorry, I gotta take the hat off. It's 100 degrees and it's getting kind of distracting, so much better. I feel like now is a good time to clarify something I said at the beginning of the video. I referred to George Parrott as the worst outlaw in the Wild West. And I didn't mean like, oh, he was the most dangerous, he was the most sadistic outlaw. I mean, he was the worst outlaw. He fucking sucked at it. I don't think ever in my years of researching random people in history have I seen someone with such astonishingly bad luck. Now, the nickname, that was the first clue that nothing was gonna go right for our boy George. So the Slim Jim squad set their sights on a Union Pacific train to rob. And I think the first indication that this was not going to work should have been the fact that their plan was to derail the train in order to rob it. Let me repeat that. Their plan was to not stop, not hijack, derail the entire fucking train. I don't think people in my generation realize just how devastating a train crash was back then. Derailing a train would be like thousands of dollars in damages and almost certainly kill like dozens of people in the process. But that was the gang's plan and they were sticking to it. You know, I can tip my hat to them for that kind of determination. So our boys tamper with the train tracks so that the upcoming train would derail, and then they find a comfy spot in the bushes to wait for the fireworks. But these poor fools, they didn't realize the railroad company had a secret weapon. Railroad repair workers. So yeah, the railroad crew just shows up and fixes the tracks. According to reports, one of the members of the gang suggested that they just kill all the railroad workers so as not to gunk up their plan. But apparently George and one other gang member were really against this. My man George is like, no, we should not kill innocent people. Now excuse me as I derail a train. So yeah, rather than pulling off an epic train heist, our boys spent their afternoon sitting in the bushes watching the railroad crew fix the tracks, watching the train go safely by on the tracks, and then watching sheriffs come to arrest them for tampering with the tracks. My God, literally not one thing went right. This is the worst day ever. So anyway, 2 sheriffs show up to investigate the damaged tracks and arrest the fucking Slim Jim gang. But you think our boys are gonna take that line down? This is the Wild West we're talking about, baby. Remember, it was pretty easy to get away with crimes back then, as long as there were no witnesses. So yep, our boys kill both the sheriffs, bringing their charges from damage of government property to double homicide of law enforcement. It was at this point, I assume, the gang had a meeting and said, you know, boys, when we put our heads together, we do not come up with any good ideas. And so the gang agreed to split up and lay low until this whole double homicide thing blew over. Now, I'm sure you might have guessed this because I said George sucked at being an outlaw, but he also sucked at laying low. In fact, I think he got busted in the stupidest way in history. Wanna know how George got caught? He snitched on himself! Literally, he got drunk in a bar and just admitted to it. He really said, trust no one, not even yourself. So yeah, from here, George got arrested. He offered to snitch on the rest of the gang to get a lighter sentence. That didn't pan out. He was still sentenced to hang. But you think our boy George is gonna take that line down? Baby, this is the Wild West. He's not going down without a fight, because that worked out so well the first time. With his hanging just 1 month away, George attacked his jailer, actually gaining the upper hand and kind of holding him hostage. That is until the jailer's wife showed up to save her husband, and she came with a secret weapon. A gun. So George gets rearrested, and at this point, everyone was just sick of this loser, so they formed a lynch mob right there on the spot. I can hear you saying, oh man, George is gonna get hung. It can't get much worse than this. It can. It will. I promise you the story of the unluckiest outlaw in the Wild West. You think that dying is gonna go well for him? So the mob has it all set up for him to hang. They drop the platform, and the rope breaks. My man George falls 12 feet flat on his ass, getting his ears ripped off in the process. At this point, he literally begged the crowd to just shoot him and get it over with. But they were like, no. You're gonna walk back up those steps and you're gonna get hung again, mister. So yes, after not 1, but 2 failed attempts, George was finally hung and pronounced dead. And there ends the life of George Parrott, also known as Big Nose the Outlaw. Now, I can hear you wondering, if the subject of our story is dead, why is there so much time left in the video? Why do you think it's about to get worse? I promised you the story of the unluckiest outlaw in the Wild West. You think that he's gonna catch a break after he's dead? Partner, this is where our story starts. So yeah, George is dead and everyone's happy. But what is to become of the big-nosed body? So if you haven't gathered by now, no one loved him or anything. There wasn't friends and family clamoring to take his body for a proper burial. So George's body was essentially donated to science. Meet doctors Thomas McGee and John Eugene Osborne, two physicians who were going to study George's body for signs of criminality. Wait, there's something I'm forgetting about Dr. John. There's some weird thing about him. I don't know, it'll come to me later. Super fast history speed run. Way back in the day when our understanding of psychology was very young, a lot of people believe that people's characteristics or mental state or worth in general could be determined by the physical makeup of their brains or skull. If this all sounds like the prequel to eugenics, it's because it was that. This was the science that was used to justify slavery, and that's also why so many people loved it. I just want to explain that because while it sounds crazy that Dr. John and Thomas are trying to find the evil gene in George's body, that was considered a legitimate science back then. So anyway, our doctor friends get a hold of George's body and they crack open his head to see if they can identify the criminal part of his brain. But here's where things get fucking weird. After they had finished their studies, Dr. Thomas and Dr. John started just doing stuff with George's body. And doing stuff, I don't mean anything sexual by that, thank God. But I honestly think what they did do is worse, or at least weirder. The doctors started just using parts of George's body as household items. Okay, massive trigger warning here. If you are squeamish, or if you don't want to hear about the ridiculous desecration of a human body, you should stop watching. And I don't even mean oh, skip ahead to this part. Stop watching this video. It's not gonna get any better. I'll try not to get too graphic with the details of what happened to the cadaver, but also it's kind of impossible to not get graphic if I want to accurately tell this story. So you have been warned. It's about to get bad. Probably the most normal thing they did to George's body was make a death mask of his face using plaster of Paris. This might seem odd to us, but it was pretty common practice back in the day. Less common was the fact that his death mask didn't have ears, as remember, they had been ripped off during his horrid execution. Okay, the string broke. The little string on my hat just broke. Emergency. You know what? No, I'm just gonna take it off. This was getting distracting anyway. Yeah, that feels better. I don't know why this is the video that's turned me into a prop comic all of a sudden, but I love it. So like I said earlier, for their studies, they cut George's head open, which meant they now had a perfectly good skull cap laying around. What am I gonna do? Just let it go to waste? Dr. Thomas broke the skull cap in half. He kept one half and I am actually wearing the hat in case I have any doubters. He kept one half and he gave the other half to his assistant, Lillian Heath. Fun fact, Lillian Heath would go on to be the first certified female doctor in the state of Wyoming. She would also go on to use George's skull cap as a pen holder, a doorstop, and an ashtray. Okay, let that sink in for a minute. Ready? What if I told you we are not even close to the worst part yet? Because now it's Dr. John's turn. John removed the skin from George's back, chest, and thighs. Oh, and his nipples. He specifically cut off and saved the nipples. Then he packaged the skin up and had it sent to a tannery. He gave the tannery instructions to turn this leather into both a doctor's bag and a pair of shoes. I don't know what's worse, the fact that Dr. John wanted human skin made into a bag and shoes, or the fact that the tannery did it. They made the skin into a bag and shoes for him. Oh, and reportedly, while Dr. John loved his new swag, he was disappointed that the tannery didn't find a way to incorporate the nipples into the bag or shoes. And before you ask, yes, he did wear the shoes, and yes, he did look great in them. I guess at this point the doctors decided that there was no way they could top that, and it was time to dispose of the body. They put the rest of George's remains into a whiskey barrel and then buried the barrel in the backyard. Just kidding, bitch! Just kidding, bitch! You thought John was done? Well, the body was put into a whiskey barrel. Dr. John didn't dispose of it right away. He filled the barrel with a salt solution to preserve the rest of the body, and then he just kept picking at it. According to reports, for up to a year, Dr. John continued to dissect, experiment on, and generally poke around with this poor cadaver. Finally, after I assume he got bored with it or there just wasn't enough body left to fuck with, John sealed up the barrel and buried it in his backyard. According to reports, long after the body was buried, Dr. John continued to wear the human leather shoes. He was clearly very proud of them. In fact, he wore them to his own inaugural ball. There's something I'm forgetting about Dr. John. Oh! You know what? I just remembered the weird thing I was gonna say earlier about Dr. John. In 1892, he was elected governor of Wyoming. Let me repeat that. A U.S. representative served time in office while wearing shoes made out of human skin. Oh, and guess what? That wasn't the end of his career in politics. This motherfucker was everywhere. He served in Congress as representative of Wyoming. He was chairman of the Wyoming Democratic Party, and he was Assistant Secretary of State under President Wilson. I would like to apologize for my uncowboyly appearance. Would you believe me if I told you my filming got interrupted because I had to go to a church thing? Anyway, let's wrap up this terrible tale. I'm sick of this fucking story. I'm depressed. So, what happened to Dr. John, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Lillian, and of course, George? Nothing. Literally nothing. They faced zero repercussions for their actions. After Dr. John buried the barrel of George, all interest in what happened to this criminal's body vanished. No one cared. Until 69 years later, in 1950, a crew of unsuspecting construction workers, while they were leveling land for a new building, stumbled across a buried barrel of bones. And like any group of white people, after discovering the most fucked up thing you've ever seen, they decided to investigate it. Although I can't exactly blame them for being curious as to what happened to this skeleton to end up in this state. Even if you ignore the unceremonious burial, even if you ignore the skull cap cut off, there was so much damage done to the rest of the skeleton. I wonder who might have caused that. Now, because the barrel was buried right by the old workplace of Dr. John and Dr. Thomas, someone put two and two together and realized if we want to get answers, we should go ask Dr. Lillian. Yes, Dr. Lillian Heath, now 80 years old, first female physician in Wyoming, was still alive and kicking. And not only did she remember the experiments done to George's body, she still had the fucking skull cap. She voluntarily gave the skull cap to the people who were investigating this cadaver, I assume after really quick dumping out the cigarette butts, you know? And sure enough, the cap fit onto the desecrated skull like a glove. Subsequent DNA tests confirmed that the cap, the skull, the bones, and the shoes all came from the same dead man. So, where lies George now? What has become of our big-nosed buddy? Well, if you storms brewing. If you want to see the remains yourself, you can. The Carbon County Museum in Rawlins, Wyoming has a cute little display where you can see George's death mask, broken skull, and skin shoes. Oh, speaking of grisly displays of death, if you ever want to see a dead body, just pick an old Wild West outlaw and do even a little bit of research into them. I guarantee you will come across a picture of their dead body on like the first page of the Google results. Turns out a lot of outlaws got this treatment of after their death being kept like a trophy or paraded around like the king of the north. So it's time to ask the worst question. What did we learn today? The story of George Parrott is indeed an insane one, but I also think it's a pretty good representation of like just what life was like back then. Like I said, it was a harsh time. It was a lawless land. If you didn't die at the hands of an outlaw, you'd probably die at the hands of nature. The Wild West operated under this weird kind of street justice where if someone wronged you, the law enforcement probably couldn't make them face consequences, and so you were better off just killing them and then not facing any consequences yourself. I can't help but find it kind of ironic that George Parrott was sentenced to death for the crime of murder, you know? But a lot of the people in the lynch mob that hung him probably also committed murder. And I want to make this clear. I'm not arguing that George Parrott was like an angel or anything. You know, he was a criminal. He did kill people. He deserved to face consequences for that. Maybe this is just me being a bleeding heart liberal, but in my opinion, getting hung 3 times, ears ripped off, head cracked open, brain scooped out, cigarette butts stubbed out in your skull cap, skin removed, shoes made out of your skin, experimented on by a mad scientist, and buried in a barrel of saline is a little too harsh of consequences. Anyway, I'm ready to be done with this story. This has been depressing as fuck. I've been looking at pictures of dead bodies for weeks. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you for your patience as always. Subscribe if you want to, don't if you don't, and I'll see you next whenever I upload. Bye. Oh my god, I can't believe I forgot to mention this earlier. Want to know the most fucked up thing about the story of George Parrott? He's French. George Parrott was a fucking French guy. I mean, like, his nationality was French. He was born there. Like, my brother in Christ, how did you end up in the United States getting made fun of for the size of your nose?